started. So welcome to this event. This is a conversation between Dr. James Fenwick and Dr. Karen Ritzenhoff entitled Reassessing the Male Auteur After Me Too, a case study of Stanley Kubrick. And I'll introduce the event itself a bit more in a bit. But first off, I will do some housekeeping and some general introductions, just so you know why we're all here and what we're doing. This is an event by the Midlands Network of Popular Culture. We're a network that's dedicated to, surprisingly, uniting scholars of popular culture. We're particularly keen to create an environment that's welcoming to postgrads and early career researchers. And we were originally based in the UK Midlands, but our events and our membership is open to literally anybody, welcome and open to all, and especially in COVID times, doing online events, geography becomes pretty meaningless. So please do feel free, to keep up with us and join us if you like. We do monthly events of all kinds, really. We do sometimes lectures, sometimes conversations like this one, or roundtables, or works in progress, things like that. And to keep up with us, you can check our website, and you can sign up to be a free member if you want to, which means you get a monthly-ish newsletter. I'll put that in the chat for everybody. If you want to find, this is our website. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Lucy, on it. And we upload recordings of our events there as well. And we have a blog, which is accepting essays, reviews, blog posts, etc. if you're interested in writing for it. And if you do want to follow us on social media, you can do. On Twitter, we are at MidsPopCulture. So please do feel free to follow us as well if you want to. I am Cassie, Dr. Cassie Brummett. I'm one of the events managers for the network. I'll be chairing this conversation tonight. Other committee members that are here today include Lucy Hargrave, who is moderating today. So she's looking after any questions that you have in the audience Q&A section. And she's also our HR manager for the network. And we also have Katie, Catherine Parsons, our other events manager here as well. But anyway, enough about us. Round to this event. In this conversation, we'll be exploring one of Western film history's most famous auteurs, the filmmaker Stanley Kubrick, and we'll be considering him and his films production cultures within the contemporary context of Hollywood, of Me Too, and of Time's Up as well. And I think anyone who's studied film will probably know that there's a lot of scholarly and popular work that's been written about Kubrick before. And his films are widely culturally acclaimed in the mainstream and in academia as well. However, in recent years, as I'm sure we all know, there's been increasing attention paid to the problematic exploitative or misogynistic behavior from people within the film industry. So people like Harvey Weinstein have come under attack, Kevin Spacey, Woody Allen, just to name a few. And their work and their legacies are being reassessed in light of these allegations or evidence of exploitative or abusive behavior. So one of the aims of this event is to consider where Stanley Kubrick stands in this context. And our speakers are going to raise some issues from Kubrick's films and the production cultures on his films to discuss how we might begin to start incorporating problematic elements of Kubrick's career into studies of film history. The structure will be, first off, our two speakers. So we've got James Fenwick and Karen Ritzenhoff here today. Each of them will give a separate position paper. Essentially, what it is an outline of their research on Kubrick and some of their key findings and issues to introduce us to the topic. Those will be about 5 to 10 minutes each. And then we'll launch into the conversation between the two, which will be the bulk of it, where they'll kind of candidly chat about some of these issues, expand on them, and what it means for teaching and researching Kubrick as well. That will last up to half an hour. And then we'll take a 5 to 10 minute break. And that will be followed by an audience Q&A, which is where you guys can come in and ask your questions or, raise points of discussion as well. And you can use the break to think of your questions and type them into the chat as well if you want. If you type your question in the chat, Lucy and I will collect it and we'll read it aloud for you. But if you'd like to ask your question out loud, you can do. You can signal that when you ask a question, just say something like, I'm happy to speak out loud, or you can hit the raise hand function as well, and then we can come around to you. But just before we start, just wanted to give you a quick note just about our code of conduct. So in line with our network's policy around inclusion and respect, we want our events, of course, to be safe for everyone. So this means that things like sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, otherwise offensive behaviour isn't acceptable, and we request that everyone remains respectful at all times of attendees and speakers alike. And if you don't follow this, we will boot you Jackie Weaver style from the event. And finally, just a quick content warning as well. I don't think there's going to be any clips featuring any distressing content today, no. But obviously, due to the nature of this event, there will be discussion around potentially sensitive topics like sexualization and objectification of women, sexual violence, exploitation, maybe even kind of racism as well. So please be aware of this. If you have any issues around the content, you can either private message me or Lucy on the Zoom chat, or you can always email us separately as well. Pop that in the chat there for you. If you could keep your mics off during the position papers in the conversation section, that'd be great, please, to just minimize disruption. In the audience Q&A section, that's where, you know, people are more free to kind of come in and ask questions and, you know, make comments, things like that. Although, of course, you can always type in the chat throughout the whole session as well, if you like, and chat between you. And like I said, it's up to you if you want to keep your camera on or off. Okay. Without further ado, I will introduce our two speakers. Karen will do her position paper first, and then James, and then the conversation, of course. So I'll do some introductions just quickly. Karen Ritzenhoff is joining us from Central Connecticut State University. She's published widely on gender, sexuality, and identity. And in terms of Kubrick, she's currently co-editing the book Gender, Power and Identity in the Films of Stanley Kubrick. And she wrote the chapter Kubrick and Feminism in the recent Bloomsbury Companion to Stanley Kubrick. And James Fenwick, who you'll hear from shortly, is from Sheffield Hallam University, and he's published extensively on Kubrick, including his monograph Stanley Kubrick Produces. He co-edited Understanding Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he has an article called Problems with Kubrick, Reframing Stanley Kubrick Through Archival Research, forthcoming in the New Review of Film and Television Studies. All right, enough from me, thank you. Karen, please take it away when you're ready.
Good. Cassie, thank you so much for facilitating that conversation. Cassie has worked relentlessly behind the scenes and structured everything. And I also want to thank James for inviting me to share in some of these ideas. And I welcome my friends and colleagues and new faces. And I hope we have a lively discussion. As Cassie said, so I'm in communication, so I'm going to do some PR. So this book just came out. It's the co-edited volume by Nathan Abrams and Ian Hunter, the Bloomsbury Companion to Stanley Kubrick, and several of the authors of the chapters are here today on the Zoom call. I can see their faces. So this is, so to say, fresh off the printer, and my chapter was on Kubrick and feminism. I have also co-edited a book with Catriona McAvoy, who is in the audience, Selling Sex on Screen, From Weimar Cinema to Zombie Porn. That's probably the sexiest title of any book that I've ever thought of. And so we wrote about Eyes Wide Shut and compared it to Steve McQueen's Shame. And then there's also a book here that's a fantastic volume co-edited by Tatjana Lucic, Peter Kramer, and Richard Daniels, the former director, Georgina Orgill's predecessor in the Kubrick archives. And they entitled this volume, Stanley Kubrick, New Perspectives. And I wrote about the palm trees in Full Metal Jacket. So I wanted to start with Full Metal Jacket. And so in the fall, I taught a class as adjunct at the University of Hartford in Connecticut on Stanley Kubrick. They let me teach an entire module on Stanley Kubrick. And so I rewatched all of his films with my students again. And what is different from being in a scholarly context is if you watch these films with students, they raise issues that maybe in conferences wouldn't come up. So Lolita, for example, is cringeworthy. Then there are also issues around Eyes Wide Shut, of course, and Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange, Dr. Strangelove. So I wanted to just do a quick tour de force and introduce you to some of the contemporary issues that might come up when we look at these films with a contemporary audience that is, so to say, not aware of the politics behind the scene and of all the tremendous and impressive research that has been done over the years. First off, Cassie mentioned that we assess Stanley Kubrick again in light of Me Too, and she mentioned Harvey Weinstein and Woody Allen. I think most importantly, we have to, so to say, set the record straight that Kubrick is not, so to say, in that league of auteurs. So like Jeffrey Epstein, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, Harvey Weinstein, who were, so to say, under scrutiny for sexual scandals or financial scandals, or auteurs such as Roman Polanski, even Alfred Hitchcock, Woody Allen, but also writers like Philip Roth or painters like Lucian Freud, who fathered, 40 children with his models. Kubrick is not at all, so to say, to quote from Alex in A Clockwork Orange, he's not a dirty old tsumka. He's a family man and praised for his family life. So when we look at him, we're not looking at some kind of revelations about his personal conduct, but we are looking at ways to talk about representation that might not have been looked at like this before. And I think James is going to explain to you in his presentation what he is unearthing in the archives and what he is not ignoring. So that's more, I think, where we are going towards. You can do research and find things you didn't expect, but then you also have to decide as a researcher, do I pay attention to those? Do I ignore them? Are they worth looking into? So in this context, I wanted to say that quite recently, in March 2021, 8 people were assassinated by a killer in Atlanta, and 6 of them were sex workers of Asian descent. And so I was made aware that this discourse on sexualizing Asian women really is brought back to Stanley Kubrick's A Full Metal Jacket. So as you know, he features Vietnamese women 3 times, twice as prostitutes, one as the sniper. And I have to go forward here in this. I grabbed a screen from the streaming of A Full Metal Jacket. Here you see Matthew Modine in the role of Joker, and Da Nang Hooker, Papillon Sue as the prostitute who is asking, me so horny, me love you long time, and me sucky sucky. So you are probably familiar with that. And here there was a response in popular press. So this is not an academic magazine, of course, Cosmopolitan, but she wrote Hollywood's Fetishization of Asian Women, and she described here, it's safe to say, without exaggeration, that every Asian woman has heard the phrase, me so horny, me love you long time, while walking down the street in America. First uttered in Stanley Kubrick's 1987 movie about the Vietnam War, Full Metal Jacket, that phrase haunts Asian women because it reduces us to serve one purpose, male consumption. I was young when I first heard it, but it always pops up, usually while I'm walking past someone who yells it in my face. So I just wanted to say that even if scholars think that there's nothing offensive, we can frame these depictions and representations of women in Stanley Kubrick's oeuvre as depicting and criticizing toxic masculinity and male anxiety, and that Kubrick is really diving into that topic. What we cannot ignore is that indeed it raises red flags when watching it in 2021. So what this author is saying is that there are real consequences. So here you can see one of these walls of flowers to commemorate the victims. Mourners paid their respects at a makeshift memorial outside the Gold Spar on March 19th in Atlanta after shootings at 3 area spas killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent. So these are not, so to say, commemorative palm trees for the victims, but this is this earth-shattering research that I did in the archives, and you can hear me saying it with a grain of salt. I was so excited when I dove into the archives and I found these hand-painted palm trees. So I was very lucky because you never really know what you're finding, and I found letters, this one to Jan Harlan, the brother-in-law who is still alive and well and keeps close look at what is published and being said and what kind of archival research is being done in the Kubrick archives. So the family is still very involved in guarding the official image of Kubrick. This is this factory, again, still that I found in the archives of Beckham, where a Full Metal Jacket was shot and that was transformed into Vietnam. Here's the kind of stuff that you also find in the archive that I think is worth gold. This is Kubrick's handwriting, describing his film and asking for permission to work in the gasworks. This is something for film scholars that makes us all giddy and excited. Here is a pre-production shot, and then you see how it was translated in the real film. Very mundane. It goes into details like how deep did the trees have to be planted not to die. And then you see also other screenshots. So that's the kind of stuff that I did before and that has also been published. And then you look at this idea of sexual discharge. So a scholar in 2007 said the shot is the center, the murderous use of weapon is the sexual discharge, and the shooting of the picture. That's something that intersects both with the work of cameramen in Full Metal Jacket, but then ultimately with the final death, so to say, of the shooter who gets assassinated and shot like an animal on the ground at the end of a Full Metal Jacket. So this is a scene where the second prostitute is bartering with the soldiers about her fee. This is a scene, again, where you can ignore it, or when you show it to students, you need to put a disclaimer because she refuses to sleep with 8-Ball. And then they come to an agreement. So this is this actor is one of the few African-American actors in all of Stanley Kubrick's work. And so, like Cassie said, in our new book that is under contract, Gender, Power, and Identity, with Diana Metlich and Jeremy Shanowski, we are going to try and highlight issues concerning gender and race. Here is the last scene from Full Metal Jacket, and that's how I'm going to end my first, so to say, statement, is by running through a few pictures and then handing it over to James. So this is the scene of the sniper begging to be shot, and then she's killed in this cathartic moment by the main character who previously malfunctioned and couldn't shoot before he sings the Mickey Mouse March. So these are the 4 famous minutes of the secretary in Dr. Strangelove, who is taking the phone about the end of the world in her love nest with one of the American generals in the bikini. Here is Lolita, the actress Sue Lyon, and that's the other research I am currently involved in and that I was happy to do in the archives. Kubrick needed to adhere to the production code restrictions, but he asked his buddy Bert Stern, who was a famous fashion photographer in New York and photographed people like Marilyn Monroe in the last sitting, to take Sue Lyon on a weekend trip to Bar Harbor and Long Island, and photographed her. And there are about 300 pictures in the archives unlabeled in one of these gray boxes, and she's licking a lot of stuff. So he had the task of photographing her. Her mother was there, but she's not in the picture. So she's in bed with comic strips and her nightgown. She's licking on red, blue, green, and yellow lollipops. She's concealed behind these dollar store glasses that made it into the poster, even though they were not in the film. She's licking ice cream and more lollipops and lipstick. This is the back view mirror shot that ultimately became the iconic image of the poster. Here is the end of Lolita, or the beginning, with the deadly shootings of the Humphrey character who abused her, raped her, and I would contest the idea that she seduced him. Here is the famous shot from The Shining. That's probably the best known conflict with a female actress that Kubrick had. Here is a still. I deliberately took one where the actress is not stripped naked, because the original actress who was cast for this role refused, because it took an incredible amount of nudity for the rape scenes to be shot. Here is a project that I'm working on currently, the Catwoman, who is transformed from an elderly Sumka, so to say, with the walking stick, into this yoga goddess who is stretching her legs. And the idea to put Macking's female eroticism on the wall, that's something that Kubrick invented for this role. So here she gets clubbed to death. He doesn't show her skull being bashed by the ginormous phallus, but shows this vagina dentata, the teeth in a female mouth that are also, so to say, linked with castration anxiety. Here's the phallus. I took that shot from the exhibit, and I love that it says, "Please do not touch," as if anybody wants to play Alex and give it a good tip. Here he is again in the boudoir. Here's the exhibit, the famous tables from A Clockwork Orange with women's pubic hair and milk, laced milk spreading out of their boobies. The picture of the twins who get, of course, killed in The Shining. And Catriona did a wonderful interview with the original twins who said, you know, the blood was cold, but otherwise we were treated beautifully. But this is, so to say, the last slide that I wanted to show you, is that Kubrick is part of the popular imagination. So even if you don't agree with this beginning of my intervention about the journalists and cultural critics who see a reference between Full Metal Jacket and contemporary hostility towards women of Asian descent, Kubrick's iconography is world famous. And I suggest that we look at those echoes and ripple effects in popular culture and in the, so to say, popular psyche. So this is a juxtaposition that one of my students found, who wrote a paper about comparing us with The Shining. And so you can see that male and female auteurs reflect on Kubrick. And I think that's also our role, to not ignore those signs of violence against women and reassess them. James, I'm going to make you host now and stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was great. Right, what do I do? 12 months of teaching on Zoom and I'm still saying, what do I do? Share screen. Oh no, I can't share it.
Do you not have the permissions, James?
I don't have permission, it says.
Oh dear.
So, Cassie, can you hover over his image and make him host? Because I don't have that function either anymore.
I don't have that
function.
function.
Co-host now, James.
Yeah,
oh, there we go. Yeah.
Perfect. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without a technical hitch, would it?
Oh no, yeah. Can you see the PowerPoint slides? That's the question.
Yes.
Yes. Excellent stuff. Right. Well, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much to Cassie and so on for organising this event. What I'm going to do with this short 10-minute talk today is going to be basically more of a kind of a reflective account than it is an outright academic paper. And that's because I want to emphasize my own critical kind of journey, if you will, in reassessing a male auteur in the form of Stanley Kubrick. Now, I should start by saying how I first became a fan of Kubrick as a teenager. I obsessed over him and his films, and I watched them again and again, playing the opening scenes of films like Full Metal Jacket or A Clockwork Orange. And I was, to be quite honest, thrilled by the orgiastic violence that I was watching. Now, I'm telling you this because I think, in fact, I know it shaped the way that I first approached both researching and teaching Kubrick. But there's been two key turning points for me in teaching and research, and I want to quickly just illustrate those for you, just to hopefully open up a bit of a discussion about the ways that I've been reassessing this particular male auteur. Now, the first turning point is something that I'm not particularly proud of, and it's something that has affected my teaching life at university ever since it happened. I was a lecturer at UWE Bristol at the time, and I was delivering a workshop on professional film writing. And I wanted the students to respond to a film that I was going to show them. And I hadn't prepared them in advance, nor told them what the film would be that I would be screening. I didn't want to influence basically how they were going to respond to this film on the day. Now, the seminar was only small, and on that particular day, there was only one female student in the class and the rest were men. She was sat at the front alone, the men were sat at the back in a group, and I was sat to the side. And then I started to play the first 20 minutes of A Clockwork Orange. What was I doing? Now, I don't know how many of you are really kind of familiar with that film, but the first half of that film, the first 20 minutes, if you will, features some of its most notorious moments, including several scenes of sexual assault and rape. So I'll just quickly read out for you a recent account of this moment that I gave at a conference paper earlier this year. So, quote, "As the film played, I began to feel uncomfortable as I sensed that the female student shifted uneasily in her seat. The men kept sniggering and lauding the violence on screen. The film got to the scene featuring a rape on a stage by Billy Boy's gang. As the woman was dragged on stage, I got up and I stopped the film. I hadn't intended to, but for the first time, I felt and experienced A Clockwork Orange in an uncomfortable, unsettling and disturbing way. I was teaching A Clockwork Orange as if I was still that teenage boy, excited by the glorified violence on screen. So I decided to have a conversation with the students immediately afterwards. I started by saying that I had felt uncomfortable watching A Clockwork Orange, and the female student said the same. She said she felt uncomfortable, disempowered, and awkward. And it was the first time I discussed with students the problematic nature of A Clockwork Orange, and it was an absolute revelation. Now, one final point to make is how a couple of days later, I discussed this with some colleagues at a conference, and was shocked because I had a bit of a heated exchange with one of my colleagues who said, quote, "It's her problem." He, for it was a male academic, was suggesting that the female student was at fault for feeling uncomfortable with the film. I'll leave that story there. Now, the next turning point is perhaps not as decisive as the story that I've just, but relates directly to my research. So I've been researching Kubrick's films for many years now, with all of my work informed by archival research. Primarily, I've used a Stanley Kubrick archive that is in London, and I've been using it for about a decade now. And when I first started using it, I always centered Kubrick, by which I mean I went into the archive expecting to find the holy grail of his genius and ignored anything that wasn't to do with him. And I've looked back at my early notes from those first visits to the archive, and I literally dismissed anything not directly about Kubrick, using words such as irrelevant, nonsense, useless. However, I just want to quickly point out that if you go into the Stanley Kubrick archive, it is primarily an archive that isn't about Kubrick, okay? A really important point. Now, as I was conducting archival research for my PhD and later for my first book, I kept coming across material about Kubrick that can only be described as problematic, okay? A word that, is very kind of contentious in this Me Too age. But it's problematic because it was literally material that kind of challenged the kind of dominant historical narratives about Kubrick and his films. Yet it was material I would not kind of see being discussed in the vast literature of Kubrick, on Kubrick that was out there. And I asked myself, why was that? Was it because the Kubrick scholarly community, myself included, have a close relationship with Kubrick family, probably too close? The family, after all, certainly do not want the inconvenient truths about Kubrick and his films discussed. Or does it say something more about the notion of the auteur and the way that we collectively, as a scholarly community, still perceive, value, and understand the auteur? I want to briefly conclude by discussing the kind of material to which I'm referring, and to consider how it might contribute to a reassessment of Kubrick, focusing on the issue of women in production cultures. Now, the kind of material that can be found in the archive can only evoke a moment in time. That is all, and not a full lived experience, okay? There are gaps and silences, and there is always the danger of suggesting a narrative of a victim when looking at this material. And I think we have to be careful and try to avoid doing that, okay? And I say this in order to qualify the kinds of material that I want to share with you. Now, the example I want to use are Kubrick's personal casting notes for Clockwork Orange, sheets of paper filled with names of actors next to which Kubrick has written comments about their auditions. Now, I first came across these notes in my initial visits to the archive, but never knew what to do with them. But I realised they potentially evoked production environment and a production culture on A Clockwork Orange. Now, Kubrick was writing about women in a way that focused on their bodies in a way that was not obviously necessary. He used a shorthand, which I put on this PowerPoint for you. Now, using a shorthand when having to go through hundreds of auditions is not in itself unique. But here we have archival documents in which Kubrick was using a shorthand that's focused specifically on parts of the female body. Now, this shorthand would then be, oh, sorry, I should point out, so the shorthand there, for instance, VGF, very good figure, VGL, very good legs, and so on. The bottom three, I have no idea what they refer to, but I'm sure we can all hazard a guess. Now, this shorthand would then be deployed in more expansive descriptions, as you can see on this particular slide. Once again, the focus is on the female body. In focus on women's breasts and legs leads him to literally marginalise his notes and acting ability in the margins of the pieces of paper that he was writing on. Now, words about breasts would often be written in capital letters, underlined, written in large letters, as you can see there. VG bust, spectacular bust, huge breasts, whilst notes about acting would be sidelined and written in small letters. Now, I draw your attention to that final note on the PowerPoint, which refers to a woman that was auditioning for no specific part, but was eventually cast in the role of the woman to be raped by Billy Boy and his gang. Fair act, huge breasts, top quality, figure model type of breasts, huge breasts, handmaiden. Now, I'll come back to that note shortly. Now, it must be noted just before I move on that, in contrast, Kubrick did not devise or use a shorthand in relation to the men that he were auditioning, and he focused more on acting ability and his perception of men's intelligence. Now, in considering the reassessment of male auteurs, I briefly want to refer to the work of Stefania Marghitu on auteur apologism. Now, Marghitu argues how at times some critics, academics, fans, and others besides adopt a position that counteracts feminist movements, women's stories of sexual harassment, abuse, and assault, and discrimination, or in how women are represented on screen. And they do so in order to avoid having to discuss the inconvenient truths. Now, I've previously taken this approach myself. Now, auteur apologism takes this form of suggesting controversy, problematic behaviour, and exploitative practices as being a normal and required aspect of the male auteur. As Marghitu argues, auteur apologism is the, quote, separation of the art from the artist, underpinned by the claim that problematic identity is a prerequisite for creative genius. So what of Kubrick? If we take that note that I previously mentioned, in which Kubrick describes a woman as a tart and then proceeded to cast it in the role of someone that was raped, is it possible at that point to separate the art from the artist? Or does it fundamentally reframe the way that we can understand and analyse that particular scene in which the character is raped? In fact, can the entirety of A Clockwork Orange be reframed in the light of this quote? I don't know. But when there's archival evidence that Kubrick's approach to casting women in A Clockwork Orange was not atypical, but in fact a feature across his career, repeatedly taking such an approach on other films, can and should we then reassess Kubrick himself in light of this information? So I've got no answers to these questions, but hopefully they are the kinds of questions, along with the kind of stuff that Karen's just been discussing, that will open up a discussion. So that is my talk in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, James and Karen. Two really interesting kind of introductions to the kind of some of the issues around Kubrick, coming at it from two different angles, some kind of film kind of visual and textual analysis there, and then some kind of archive work too. I think we'll go straight into the conversation between the two of you to sort of try and delve into these issues a little bit more but more deeply might give you a bit of chance to expand on some of those things that you sort of hinted at, and kind of look into those like the key issues more deeply. Particularly, I think around some of the things I think we might talk about, the auteur apologism that you were talking about, James, and separating the art from the artist, and problematic representations of women in the films, and also how we teach Kubrick. That came out across both of your talks as well. I'm largely going to keep out of the conversation because it's all about you two as the experts here. But I thought, just to get you going, I wondered if you wouldn't mind if you could pick up on something that you both mentioned actually, but James talked about I think most, which is archives. And I wondered if you could both talk a little bit about, first off, what it's like doing research in the archives, in the Stanley Kubrick archive, and maybe what you think the value is of that as a research method when it comes to looking at Kubrick.
Karen, I think you need to tell us all about your experience in the archive first. What was it like for you?
So I was first in the archives, I think, shortly after they opened. And I was incredibly giddy getting there because it's in the heart of London, and you make an appointment beforehand. And then there's a room that is crafted after the room in 2001. That's where you have some tables set up. And it was my dream then to bring students to the archives. And I managed to do that in the summer of 2018. I brought 17 students to London, and we actually visited the archives. And I think for them, that was the most exciting moment, because they were masks from Eyes Wide Shut and the original manuscript from The Shining, and costume design for A Clockwork Orange, and the pictures about Lolita. That's when I heard about Bert Stern's photography collection that is housed there. So one of the things is that you don't know what you're going to find. And so I think what James likes me to confess is that I went the first time and it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And it's not like you say, oh, I want to do research on A Clockwork Orange, show me the goods, but you have to research it, and you get one box at a time. And even pre-COVID, you had to have gloves, and you open the box. And I'm a very cluttery hoarder person, maybe because I immigrated to the United States and have this image of my coming in with a suitcase. I keep everything, which drives my family crazy. But Kubrick was worse than me. So I always joke, if he held a Starbucks cup on June 21st, 2021, it would have a little note, held by the master, and go into a box. So you look at some of these boxes and it's plain rubbish. And then every now and then you find something, you have no idea what it is. And the archivists are brilliant. They sit behind a glass window and make sure that you don't eat the manuscript or or stuff it in your purse. But they will not solve all the questions. So the truth is that you sometimes really have no idea what you're dealing with. And it's people like James or Catriona or Nathan or Filippo who's here, or Joy or Lawrence, who so to say bring light into the chaos, and spend an enormous amount of lifetime and love and passion in order to decipher it. I don't know, Filippo, if I can quote you, but Filippo is working on an authoritative biography about Stanley Kubrick, and also translated the memoirs of Stanley Kubrick's Italian handyman, who got hired after transporting that ginormous phallus in his sports car through a rainstorm back to the studio. I've lost some friends over telling that anecdote and social events. But Filippo told me once, and I thought that was really insightful. He said, I really rely on the facts, what I see in the archives. I'm not interested on yet another musing of textual analysis. And I think since I'm mostly a pedagogue who teaches, I I rely a lot on textual analysis because, of course, it's about critical thinking and film analysis, but because Kubrick was so extraordinarily meticulous and detail-oriented, every little, even, mundane detail, the button on an extra in Barry Lyndon was designed, supervised, directed by him. So you can't ever go too far with your analysis. And that's what the archives confirmed, that he and his cohort and his production assistant, would spend a year photographing different streets in America so he could rebuild a New York storefront for Eyes Wide Shut in London, because, as those of you who are familiar with his work know, but I didn't know that until I started working on Stanley Kubrick, this after Spartacus, he did not go back to the United States. So he lived 40 years in England. He lived north of London. He produced all these works in studios or in Beckton, and had remote teams, for example, film the Overlook Hotel. But so that's a very idiosyncratic story. There are myths about it, there are rumors about it, there are conspiracy theories about it, but the truth is he sat on this estate and imagined the world, Napoleon, the Holocaust, the future, space. There's no stone that he left untouched, but we only know, of course, the masterworks that came into being. The archives have a lot of holdings on films that were never realized. James, I'm tossing it to you.
I think that's interesting, and I think for me a hint, because I always see the archive as, initially, as I said that, I approached it very much. I still am a fan of Kubrick, I should stress that, but I approached it, I think, initially, as I say, as that teenage boy, and I was obsessed about trying to find out the genius of Kubrick. I remember, like, in the catalogue, there was something about how there was this box and it contained this chart in which Kubrick mapped out his entire career or something. I was like, oh my God, what is this? I've got to go in and find it. And I went in and requested this box, because when you go into the archive, like most archives that you go to, you have to sit in the reading room, you write out what you want, kind of the code using a catalogue, then the staff go into the back and fetch the box and bring it out for you. And they brought this box, they put it in front of me, and it's so exciting because you never know what you're going to find. You open the box, and there was all this paper in there, and none of it had to do with this thing that was in the catalogue. I thought, what's going on here? And I was scrambling through all this paper. Eventually I thought, is this it? Is this the scrap of paper that is described as being as kind of the holy grail of Kubrick? And it was indecipherable. It was just a piece of paper that was kind of dog-eared, stained. And I couldn't, because it was handwritten, I couldn't understand what Kubrick had written. And in the end, it was pointless to me. It meant nothing. And I think it was at that point I started to realize that the kind of the myths of Kubrick, the way that we kind of understand him as this grand genius, which he himself had a huge hand, as Filippo Olivieri has kind of been writing about. He had a huge part in crafting this myth. The archive, however, can play a role in perhaps deconstructing that myth somewhat. And I think whilst it's important we acknowledge that, yeah, he was someone that had these kind of artistic visions. Think of something like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Over 1,000 people at one point worked on that film, and the archive has records of them contained within it. And suddenly you can start to open up an environment and an understanding of how these films weren't just produced by one man, even though he himself probably wants the world to think that was the case. Directed, produced, written by Kubrick, did the camera. Yeah, he might have done it at times, but there are other people doing it as well. And I think that is, for me, when you start reassessing an auteur, I think that's probably why some people get annoyed, because you kind of, not trying to topple the kind of artistic genius, but when it comes to something like film production, there's so many people involved. And when you start scratching away at the surface, perhaps he wasn't as, this kind of grand genius as we all kind of tried to make out that he was. I don't know if what I'm saying there is too controversial or absolute nonsense. I've no idea, but yeah. Do you think it's controversial, Karen?
No, I just wanted to make a pitch again for Catriona, who did a lot of research in the archives and wrote the chapter on the archives for the Bloomsbury Companion and also interviewed people. So what is interesting when James talks about the production background, I had a chance to interview one of the women who worked on the model for 2001. So there were also women behind the scenes. I think that that's still an issue that could be explored, because in a lot of film we only see talking heads of men who worked behind the scenes. Another book, I didn't bring all my Kubrick books, but this is very recent. It's Nathan Abrams, who is so to say the leader of the tribe, with his book Stanley Kubrick, New York Jewish Intellectual, and he is coming out with several more volumes and has integrated a lot of the research on the archive. So that's, so to say, the next generation. It's like Kubrick Archives 2.0, because these are scholars who do extensive research in the archives and then integrate it in their scholarship, contrary to somebody like James Narramore, who is represented at the traveling exhibit of the Kubrick show that goes around the world. And I was so mad. I went there with my mom and I thought I could show her, so to say, these Kubrick books, and none of them were in the bookstore. So that goes into this idea that his legacy is closely guarded. And so Narramore is in, Nathan has presented with Jan Harlan, who I briefly mentioned, who is very active, the brother-in-law, and Christiane's brother. But they really look out what the academics are doing. And I think there are also moments where it's a no-go, where you don't get permission to publish something or show something. I thought that was the case in New Perspectives. Now, here's something, James. When you come across that sheet of paper in the box and it says, odd, ugly breasts. What do you make of this? I mean, is it like, woohoo, I found something that is really awkward? Because I was thinking on this morning, I thought, man, we just emerged from 4 years of Donald Trump, who said, grab them by the pussy. You know, I mean, it's just like, he became president of the United States and he might win again. I don't know, I hope not. But it's just like, oh, well, that's, you know, boys being boys, or it's locker talk, so nobody gets bent out of shape. But I wonder what this FFF is. Has it something to do with what I think it does, or what? So
dare I ask what you think it's to do with?
But I mean, how it shows that there is a sexualization, exactly what we are after, so to say, to show that you can also find that in the films. I know that Catriona, who is not seen here but is working with you too, in her extensive research sometimes has found that there is no abuse, or that there's no, so to say, questionable behavior, or that actresses never said anything they rave. I mean, Nicole Kidman is famous for saying that this was her favorite director to work with. And
see, this is the thing that I find interesting though, Karen, because what you said then, the Kubrick estate will roll, they've had a mission kind of, since 1999, a stated mission to protect the Kubrick kind of legacy and the Kubrick myth. And they will roll out certain figures to say, yep, Kubrick was fine, he's a great individual. And that I find kind of really weird, because why are they doing that? Why do they feel the need to do that? In terms of kind of the, well, this stuff, it doesn't show, we said that at the start, Harvey Weinstein. This is not showing someone that's a Harvey Weinstein. And again, as I said, I don't think you can, when it comes to archival documents, you have to be careful, because it is just a moment. That's all it's evoking, a particular moment where this man, for whatever reason, wrote these comments down on a piece of paper whilst he was looking at auditions. But I mean, for me, I don't know whether this link can or should be made, and I think it's why the question is important. And it relates to how, as you said, Karen, that research on Kubrick has largely been about textual analysis for 50 years. And it's only really in the kind of past 10 years where we started using an archive that is so big that we've only scratched the surface. But when we come across something that says fair act, huge breasts, tart quality, figure model type of huge breasts, what are we meant to do with that, particularly when we know that that individual was then cast in a role where she was raped, or a character that was nearly raped? And I don't know how to kind of, how do we incorporate that into analysis? Can we? Again, I'm kind of stuck. I don't know. Oh, sorry, Cassie, did you put your hand up?
And I was just going to say that was kind of where I thought it would be really interesting to sort of go into, like, next is can we separate, Kubrick's films from, like, the behavior and that we see in this archival evidence, the moments that we see from the archive. How do you reconcile, or how do we grapple with those, whether that's in terms of, like, studying Kubrick or understanding him as a fan, something like that? I see Karen has a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I talked yesterday with a friend who's not a film scholar or involved with the university, and I thought it was just incredible. I told him he should be on this on this panel, because he said, from his point of view, ever since he watched A Full Metal Jacket with the shooting of the sniper on the ground, that it was just that he thought, man, there's a real issue about the way violence against women is depicted, and you can't just talk it away. And I told him that originally, that's also something that I found in the literature. It might be common knowledge, but he hadn't heard about it, that originally there was a different ending where they would also dissever the head of the sniper and then play soccer with her head. So war films are ugly, and I just taught another module on war films. So I'm not saying that there's anything unusual about excruciating violence in war films, but here it's directed against women. And I think that my friend said he seems to have a blind spot, and that we all have blind spots. And so the question is, do we ignore the blind spots and focus, so to say, on the genius and on the things that are just extraordinary and evocative and thought-provoking and brilliant? Or do we at least pay attention to some of the stuff that isn't usually talked about? So maybe that's digging around in the margins, but again, for our students, those things stand out. I mean, they might be interested in talking about the prison system, or the depiction of the government or the church in A Clockwork Orange, but they can't just get through this rape scene without being still, after all these years, deeply affected. So, like James said, that has other effects, that these films still have this emotional reaction.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because you said at the start about how students might you put Lolita on and we might think it's a comedy, but students now see it and just cringe. And I think that the reaction, the student with Clockwork Orange, and the way that I'd never perceived the film in that kind of uncomfortable way. Sorry, I just got distracted there with the chat. But do you think, Karen, in terms of this idea of misogynism in the films, because that's something that does come up, this idea, was Kubrick misogynistic, or were the films misogynistic? I mean, is something like A Clockwork Orange, is it misogynistic?
I find it interesting that when I wrote the chapter on feminism, that I was asked if Kubrick wasn't a feminist. So I think that, and I thought, no. But I think that that's a huge taboo to create that label for him. It's still, I would say that, James, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the majority of Kubrick scholars would say absolutely not. And I think if you show it to lay people, they would say absolutely yes. So it's the elephant in the room. I just think, first of all, there are very few characters that you can study, like the secretary in her bikini in Dr. Strangelove. And so to answer that question, you have to dig deeper, and it's up to people like you, James, who are going to reassess the archives to, so to say, create more of a context for those observations.
I think that's important, isn't it? It's the context, and I think that is really important when it comes to teaching them as well. Rather than this idea of separating the art from the artist, or should we cancel these films or not, I think it's about just putting them in the absolute fullest context. Particularly something like A Clockwork Orange, explaining it fully, situating it within kind of the context of how films in the 1970s, early 1970s were, increasingly violent, putting it within context of kind of Post Me Too is the title of this session. All of those things I think are really important, fully grounding the films before kind of screening them. And something like Lolita, I think, as well, because that film, and no one, I don't know why we're so kind of coy about it, it's a film about an adult and a minor, and this adult falls in love with this minor and has sex with her. That's the film. Lolita is a film about a paedophile. There's no escaping it. And I think, because you mentioned the Bert Stern photographs, I do find them really, when I look at those images.
Yeah, I did in my research, I compared them 6 weeks after he did that photo shoot. Bert Stern photographed Marilyn Monroe. It was the last sitting, and a lot of the visual cliches are identical. So he photographed this, so to say, fading flower in the same kind of erotic trope as he did Sue Lyon. Sue Lyon did not sleep with Kubrick. That's for sure. She wrote him a somewhat whiny letter that is part of the exhibit that I found, where she tried to get in touch with him and said, you know, my life is okay, even though it was terribly screwed up. And he never responded to it. But I think, James, you found that she did have an erotic, so to say, interlude with one of the team members. And a lot of people say, you know, she seduced the guy. He just kind of fell into this trap. And I think, James, you mentioned in our pre-discussion that Epstein called his plane the Lolita Express. I think there is no question about the fact that it's about this criminal raping of a minor. And even if she consented to it, it's horrifying. And there are people who either are specialists on Nabokov and say, okay, it's classic literature, but that goes into this reassessment work. Is how do we teach it? How do we teach to look at it differently and not beat around the bush?
I mean, with, oh God, confessions again of teaching. I used to teach a module on Kubrick at DMU, and one of the seminars involved examining sexual innuendo in that film, spot the sexual innuendo. Now, knowing what we know about the film, it just feels really uncomfortable. Yeah, so with that, it was a case of, it's been alleged that James B. Harris, the producer of the film, may have had some kind of sexual relationship with Sue Lyon when she was 14. But there was, so what we can find in the archive is certainly a production environment that was highly sexualized. From the very beginning, when they cast Sue Lyon, where they were asking, normally you'd go into the audition and they might say, you know, what kind of films have you been in? Instead, they were asking for over an hour. What boyfriends have you had? Do you go on dates? And all these kind of questions. You think, okay, why are they asking them? Why is that appropriate? And then there's a letter within the archive that Sue Lyon has written to James B. Harris, in which she, it's kind of a joke letter. That's how the archive frames it. This idea of she's playing a schoolgirl. She's the head of the school, and she writes to James B. Harris saying, I want you to be my teacher. I want you to have a firm hand. I've been naughty. And again, you just read, and you know, Sue Lyon's a 14-year-old girl, but she's writing it to James B. Harris, and suddenly the context and the dynamics just feel a bit wrong. Then other stuff within the archive, correspondence between Kubrick and Harris. It shows the way that they were kind of trading Sue Lyon as a sexualized kind of film star that they could trade with other producers and make as much money off her as possible, as quickly as possible. Now, were they unique in doing that? Far from it. There's a history of kind of female child stars being exploited by male producers in Hollywood since the 1920s and 30s. Okay, but it's just another example of a systemic kind of approach within an industry, I think. And again, once you kind of see this information in the archive, what does that do to the way that we're having these debates still about whether, you know, the Sue Lyon character was the seducer or the seducee? What does that matter in the end? As Karen said, it's a film about a man that has sex with a minor. Yeah, I've kind of gone off a tangent there.
I wonder if, as to kind of, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time in the audience for if they have any questions. I wonder if, to end this kind of conversation section, if we could talk, you both mentioned it in your position papers and kind of briefly so far. I wonder if you had anything else you might want to say about what kind of the issues we've been discussing, how that might impact on the way that you think we should teach Kubrick, or, you know, archival work that you've been doing, James, and you, Karen. How does that impact on the way that we teach Kubrick? How does the context that we're currently operating in, how does that change the way that we would teach Kubrick, you know, for future generations of scholars and film enthusiasts?
So I just thought that I want to say that there are moments of new explorations. So Joy McEntee, who is here on the call, and Eliza Pizzotta from Italy are launching a series on race in Kubrick, which is exactly the outcome of a conference on Spartacus that took place in London via Zoom in the fall. And I'm so thrilled that there are colleagues who are, so to say, not part of this Kubrick universe, who have agreed to write for our volume on Kubrick and race. Because if you look at Spartacus with, so to say, film students who come from diverse backgrounds, and then you see that there's one African-American actor, so to say, gladiator, and hardly any literature spends much time on Draba and discussing his role, then there is room to hone in on these characters. And I think I see that Joy just put that in the chat room, that it's also a free series of lectures. So when you teach it, I think it's exciting to be open to new explorations and to not be only, so to say, constrained to saying, read this and that's the law and anything else is not correct, but to be open that you can play with some of this content and you learn a lot from the scholars who are diving into the archives, but you also, so to say, can go back and forth. It's neither this is the truth nor that is the truth, but that it's somewhere in between, and that for students, it's very exciting to have this opportunity to also learn from exploring Kubrick's oeuvre, that it's incredibly timely, that you can connect it to a lot of contemporary issues. And it's not, so to say, as one of my students said in an American history class, where he said it's old, slow, and boring. I think you can say that about 2001, that it's old, slow, and boring, but you can still talk about AI. So I use 2001 to talk about the computer, and then it opens up a treasure trove of opportunities with artificial intelligence and human machines and androids and replicants and all that good stuff. So you can use these films in so many ways, but again, there is really a library of literature, and it's very intimidating. And so I'm certainly intimidated by it, but I found it extraordinary to be able to bring Kubrick to 20 and 21 and 22-year-olds, and they got really excited about it.
Yeah, I think that's a comprehensive answer. I agree.
I just want to say thank you again to James and Karen for that, for the papers and for the conversation as well. I think there's some interesting topics that came out, and I'd be interested. I think some of the questions are kind of related to what you were talking about and asking you to expand on a little bit more detail, which I think would be great. Like I said, so for everyone, if you want to type your questions or your kind of discussion points, your thoughts into the chat, please do go ahead. I'll collate the questions, and if there's any kind of discussion points as well that I think James and Karen can pick up on, then we'll make sure that we cover those as well. This is your opportunity to get to say what you think. So please do feel free to contribute and come in. But I'll start with the first question that we had. I think it might be a smaller question, but I'll start with it. It was from Drew, who said that Perhaps worth considering with respect to Full Metal Jacket, the film, like many war films, boosted enlistment despite what most viewers agree is a negative, war is hell kind of depiction of military life. And might the promise of being able to commit violence against women have fueled this boost in enlistment?
I thought that was an extraordinary question. I responded to him, and again, this is more anecdotal than scholarly, but one of the things I've heard from students about the beginning, the first half hour of a Full Metal Jacket was boot camp, that is still pretty accurate about the way military recruits are being trained and broken down. And when James asked me about misogyny, I mean, the trainer is homophobic and racist and misogynist and absolutely everything in these rants that he then also capitalized on to have his own cable TV show on guns. I think they show this sexualization of violence and the allure of violence and the fetish of violence. And I think, James, I would like to hear from you maybe a little bit more where some of this rhetoric is also traceable in the correspondences that you found in the archives, so that it's so to say, it's not an aberration, but this idea that you compare guns to phalluses and penetration and sex and ejaculation and all that ghastly stuff. So that's really very present.
Yeah. So that thing that you just mentioned, sorry to be vulgar, but ejaculation. Again, the Kubrick family tried to make out that, Kubrick was a saint and never, ever was kind of, said a bad word. But you look at his letters, they were filled with kind of coarse language, smutty imagery, innuendo. He loved to kind of talk about ejaculation in letters between with his collaborators and so on. That was he had a kind of, from what I can kind of detect, is a very dark sense of humor, very black at times. But for instance, in 1999, Frederick Raphael published a memoir that the Kubrick family did not like, condemned it. And I wonder if it's because it portrays Kubrick in a way that, again, goes against this kind of, the myth and the legacy and all that kind of stuff, and taints him almost. But when you do see that there are letters within the archive and other material, there was something fascinating that I came across where him and a very close assistant were looking for, this was in the late 1970s, and they were trying to come up with potential taglines for Eyes Wide Shut. Kubrick tried to make Eyes Wide Shut many, many times throughout his career, and in the 1970s was thinking about doing it again, and came up with all these kind of taglines, and they were all about porn. And Kubrick had an absolute fascination with porn. I think Lawrence might have previously discussed this about kind of Kubrick's porn collection. Again, something that you're going to come across in the archive. So is that the kind of thing, Karen, you reckon? Or, yeah. Have you got another question, Cassie?
Yes, we do. We've got two questions from Mariana. I'll start with the first one. I've usually thought of Kubrick's work as cautionary tales of human capability of evil, as in he shows how awful a human being can be if we're not careful. So I have two questions. Would that be correct? And if it was, would his films be misogynistic or telling us not to be misogynistic? Who wants to tackle that?
Would that be correct? And sorry, I'm just reading it again. And if it was, would his films be misogynistic? My answer is I don't know. I don't know. That's a terrible answer. Karen, do you?
That was our carrot for this talk. So I think that the consensus in the literature is that that he's not misogynistic, that this is about toxic masculinity, and it's to reveal the violence in institutions and in Alex as a product of his time, and the violence that is exerted to him. I remember Peter Kramer, who is also, I'm just going to say it, he's a god of Kubrick studies. So maybe like in Greece, there can be several gods. He feels very strongly that Alex is a controversial character. He shouldn't be idealized, and so to say, people shouldn't make Halloween costumes with bulky cod pieces and glue, whiskers in their eyes to glorify his violent, murderous rampage. But I think that's the crux, is that generally speaking, the argument goes that Kubrick depicts toxicity and debunks it. However, the way he debunks it is that women are beaten, slaughtered, raped, so to say, dissevered. So even though you can make that overall argument, I think what I think we are trying to do with this discussion is to spend some more time looking at these moments that you can't dismiss completely. I mean, you can focus on Nicole Kidman and say, this is such a fantastic end. This was the best film he ever did. And Nicole Kidman is this character who emancipates herself, and she scares her husband with her own lust and sexuality. And she is, so to say, this little gray mouse at the beginning, and at the end, she's the one who has, who, so to say, has him like a puppet playing to her tune. I think that's a very valid point. And Diana Metlich has just written a beautiful paper also comparing this role in Eyes Wide Shut with Klimt and art and the depiction of femme fatales in art. I, so to say, I would be then interested in these excessive orgy scenes. So you can focus on the empowerment of the prostitutes in Eyes Wide Shut, or, like I said, on Nicole Kidman. But what about these oodles of women who pass the boopy test, so to say, who wear, I have to look this up, very gorgeous boobs or something, who are depicted, and their brains are screwed out to the point where, in order to release it in countries outside England, they had to Photoshop stuff in front of them. It's like they are really fucking machines. Sorry for my, here, I did it. I didn't say it and it slipped out. But I think, man, this is maybe toxic masculinity, but people go to prison for this.
Well, we lost an hour and 23 minutes without a swear bomb. So.
I think with the question,
are you going to edit this out, Lucy?
I think the question from Mariana, I would approach it, because the second part was about how would you approach Kubrick in his film work in comparison to Weinstein, Alan, Polanski, and so on. And I would approach this question from a different perspective, which would be going into the archive again and suggesting, look, there are countless times, a pattern almost of Kubrick fixating specifically on women's breasts, and at times I have no idea why, okay? For instance, there might be an entire box filled with images of women's breasts where he's taking pictures of women's breasts, or someone was for some reason. Or these kind of discussions of women's breasts, or the casting notes, again, focusing on women's breasts. At that point, and this is not me I'm perhaps avoiding answering the question about are they misogynistic or not, but what I'm trying to suggest is there is a production environment here where someone, for whatever reason, this individual is focusing on women's breasts again and again throughout his career. And I just kind of leave it, I suppose. It's that information that perhaps if we share that within kind of discussions of Kubrick, what are we meant to do with it? Does it reframe stuff? And if we start to move away from just this kind of interpreting the genius's work to actually looking at the production environment, I think at that point, we can answer that question that Mariana's posed in a very different way. Yeah, so I've avoided answering the question in this sort of way. I apologise.
I think it's a rather large topic, isn't it? Go on, Karen.
So that is the beauty of the archives. I think that there might be other archives by leading film directors, but the beauty of it is that that there's so much in the archives. There's not only material about the best known films, but also so much material about the work that was never realized. Like James said, Kubrick has been fascinated with the Traumnovelle since the early 50s. So it took him until 1999 to complete it. So he hatched on that egg, so to say, for 50 years. And so that's something that is so extraordinary, that you can dig into the archives. James, you mentioned when we discussed that people who visit tend to gravitate towards the same topics, or use it sometimes also to, so to say, validate something that they found, so to say, as if you were saying, okay, I'm sure that Kubrick was, so to say, fascinated with female physique, and then there's the little note in the box. But I think what you are doing is that you are demystifying also the work in the archives, that you look at it in great depth and make it, so to say, the center of your research, which is also fascinating.
I think that's the archive as subject rather than just source, I think is fascinating. And that can really throw up interesting questions as well about why it is that certain information is contained in the archive, why it's there, and why certain information isn't there. And also questions about who curated the archive, who's continuing to curate the archive, the way that it might be selectively used by the family, for instance. You mentioned, Karen, in the exhibition, there is a letter from Sue Lyon that kind of says, Kubrick, I love you. I forgive you for anything. You never did anything wrong. You were brilliant. But that one letter ignores all the other stuff that's in the archive. Have the family put that up there for a particular reason?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of letters, from the fanatic Christians in bloody blah, and they write handwritten, burn in hell letters, but you think they're absolute bonkers. So there's some evidence of pushback, but the people who write these letters, you think, man, you really have some mental health issues. So just you can ignore it. And then there's it is so powerful. I photographed some huge pamphlets where Kubrick says, I wish I had made the scenes between Humbert, or and Lolita more erotic. That's the big mistake in my life. So it's not as if there's any kind of backtracking. So that's something I mentioned also to Cassie and James, that I studied Spike Lee, and you can find in Spike Lee's work that he does films when he graduates from film school in 1986 very differently from his Netflix series, She's Gotta Have It, in 2017. There is a huge development. But I think pedophilia is in Lolita and it's in Eyes Wide Shut. I don't think that there is a humongous, so to say, change of mind, that suddenly this man has turned into a feminist. You can argue this, but Lawrence certainly, he's a psychologist and adds a lot. Sorry, I should mute myself. There's somebody calling. But I think this idea that Kubrick went through some kind of Star Wars or 2001 induced epiphany, where suddenly he saw the world, so to say, from the perspective of the star child, and now everything has changed. I don't see that. So correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I understand that people have issue with The Shining and saying that he tortured the female protagonist relentlessly. So apparently that's a controversial topic, but that's something we haven't even talked about much.
It's true.
I think if your hair falls out, that's a sign that you're not exactly a happy camper. So a friend of mine is a filmmaker who worked with Shelley Duvall in New York 20 years ago, and apparently that's the story of her life, to talk about, anybody who wants to hear it, how much Kubrick tortured her. But then Kubrick research argues, no, she loved him, and that was not abusive, and she just got her to play a really ghastly female character. End of story. So I'm just surprised because I'm looking for it, that sometimes there's just one sentence. End of story. Lolita seduces Humbert. Boom. The end. Or the cat lady is a filthy old hag. The end. You know, does she deserve to be clubbed to death? I don't think so.
Yeah. No, I agree though with what Karen's saying. Cassie, I'm aware that time's running out. There's a really good question at the end there by Elizabeth Mullen.
Yes. Yeah, we could go straight to that one. If you are both happy with that, let me see. So yeah, I'll read it aloud. I'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on film reception in your approach. For instance, what led to the male students in James's class sniggering and laughing to begin with? And how do changing audience dynamics influence our analysis? And then I suppose there's a kind of follow-on question. Don't know if you want to address it at the same time. Also, do you consider the auteur approach, lionizing a sole creator rather than placing them within a greater production framework as inherently sexist? Was there something in particular you wanted to address there, James?
I just think they're two very interesting questions. I think the first part there about thoughts on film reception and your approach. Then our audience, and I think that is interesting, the way that it was, the dynamics in that particular room, where it was all men. And first off, I didn't even kind of think about it. I was just in this zone where I was like, right, this is what I'm doing today, stick on the film, without thinking about what was in the film, thinking about the audience, or even placing it in kind of context. And that idea, it's just that phrase there, what led the male students in the class to snigger and laugh to begin with, I think is probably suggestive of something, perhaps the power dynamic, but also in responding to the film itself and feeling that they could laugh and snigger. I don't know. And then the second part, for me, again, it is about, and I know we're talking about Kubrick now, but I would love to get to a point where we could just move away from Kubrick. We've talked about it for 60 years. And as I say, this, 1,000 people on 2001: Space Odyssey, loads and loads of those workers were women. Joy Cuff, that Karen mentioned there, was often working on her own, and Kubrick might wander in occasionally. Okay, she was working on her own, doing a hell of a lot of work, all kinds of artistic things. Let's talk about Joy Cuff for the next, 5-10 years. Yeah, that's my response to those two questions. Perhaps not the best answers.
Do you have anything you wanted to add there, Karen?
I also find Elizabeth, this is opening a can of worm. You could write a monograph about how film studies is changing. One of the things is that it's not just Kubrick, it's so to say in the arts in general. So music, fine arts, writing. So all these grand mythic, okay, I say it, white males are debunked, so to say, in current research. Do you not receive their work anymore? And a friend of mine who is an artist said, if you, so to say, cancel culture every piglish male painter, it would be very empty. The museums would be, so to say, depleted of a lot of the work. So somehow there needs to be a way to not, so to say, discredit the auteur altogether, but to just say, okay, let's not ignore those questions that are particularly relevant and obvious to our students. I wonder, if an audience in 1962 watched Lolita differently, or if you teach in an English class Nabokov, you have to teach it differently in 2021 than you did in 1962. My girlfriend is a medievalist, and she's suddenly teaching the Canterbury Tales differently in class and talks about rape and misogyny and sexual violence. So I think it's a battle in academia, and I don't think we are particularly well equipped to lead that battle. I think we are very clumsy. Not to say, James, that you were clumsy, so to say, by saying, all right, let's watch Lolita, and then you are horrified about your students' reaction. But I see that more and more, that if you so to say, we have to teach stuff differently now than we did 10, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago. I thought America changed during the summer last year with Black Lives Matter. But you can see that it's a hot iron, man. There are so many politicians who don't want the curriculum in schools to be changed. So maybe Kubrick is not such a huge problem, but for us who are doing Kubrick studies, I think he's like a holy cow. It's very difficult to I use it like this, to put a fissure in the armor. There's almost as if there's an armor, and if you do, you are easily dismissed as I don't know, transgressive or not serious or not very well educated.
Great, thank you. So anything to add there, James?
Very good.
Okay, in that case, we will draw to a close. So I know Karen, you mentioned earlier, you've got plenty of books and chapters that people should check out. Do you have anything else you'd like to promote just at the end here?
Joy clapped, and Joy is on the forefront. So pay attention to this, to the series that's coming up. Joy, do you want to say something about it? Oh, I caught you.
That's all right.
But I think that's, so to say, the latest iteration of these discussions in the Kubrick tribe.
Yes, so we're looking at a series of workshops. In the chat, I said it was from September 7th. It's actually from September 6th. There'll be one a week on a Monday, and we've got them at time zones that aren't too inhumane for most people. So keep an eye out for those. Once I've got the speakers locked into their times, I'll broadcast the times, and I'll probably send James a link so he can get it round the networks.
I need to respond to your email, Joy.
So I think that's really exciting. They're phenomenal female researchers who study music and the art history and the different nuances of textual analysis. So it's a thriving field. I'm optimistic that James is going to provide extraordinary insights with making the archives a subject. And I just neurotically have to say that I hope that this talk didn't get me voted off the island. I hope I can continue.
Oh. No. James, do you...
Next time I'm in London, there's not a sign, no trespassing, in front of the archives.
Well, hopefully not. Do you have anything you would like to promote, James?
Not particularly, I don't think. No, I think Karen promoted it just then.
Okay, well, in that case, thank you very much to James and to Karen and to all of you for coming, and for those who asked questions as well, thank you very much for that. I hope that this was interesting and insightful. Yeah, thank you very much for coming. We will see you in the next one. Thanks very much, everyone.